Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good to have you with us today. It's a Saturday evening. It's actually Saturday night. It's not too far from midnight, to be honest. I do these things when the world slows down a little bit. I think that restless, I don't know what you want to call it, little owl in my head comes out at night and decides that it wants to do things when everybody else is asleep. So, but anyway, full disclosure, or partial, I don't know. But hey, it's been a decent week. I was super busy this week, and I know it's been a couple of weeks. I've been sitting on this episode, this part 2, waiting to hatch this thing out. I guess I don't know what I'm doing with it, but I just feel like it's taken forever to get back in here and record this thing. I'm glad folks out there are listening. It's good to have people respond on Twitter and on Facebook, and just to see different folks from different parts of the planet. You know, it's surprising and it's encouraging, and I'm glad you're out there. I mean, I don't know if I could listen to myself, but hey, some people like what I'm saying, I guess. I don't know. But no, it's a little self-deprecating, but I do put a lot of thought into it. It's fun to do this, and again, like most disclosure, maybe not full, I do this for an outlet. It's fun. I think I have a good time, and and the people that write in or say hey, think so too, and so that's good. It's a good thing to do. And it's just nice to have a variety. I know there's a lot of shows out there that cover a lot of different topics, and this is one that seems to be, the more I do it, kind of specialized, and I hate that. I wish more people were interested in finding more things out about themselves, but I think a lot of us are just busy, figuring things out that don't require so much, insight or in-depth kind of whatever viewpoints. Anyhow, thanks for listening to this show in particular. I don't come out with a weekly episode. I wish I could, but you know how it is. I mean, you get busy with your family and with your job and everything else you're doing. So I'm just glad I can get in here. I'm mainly glad to hear from people. I want to get to the shout outs. I've got a few this week that I wanted to give some shout outs to. Like I said, different parts of the planet, man. It's really cool to see that stuff coming in. So I'm going to go ahead with that. And this is going to be episode 2 of The Shadow and the Serial Killer, the BTK Serial Killer, Dennis Rader. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Write in. Put us a message on Twitter or Facebook. Tell me what you think. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did doing the research on this thing. So I will see you on the other side of this. Alright, so here's some shout outs. These are off of Twitter. So I've got Mark Jackson from the UK. He's an author from Portsmouth, UK. Good to have you out there, Mark. I've had kind of an increase from European listeners, so that's cool. I like that. I've got the Miss MRS from London Town. She's a mother and a wife to the Mister. Imagine that. No one saw that coming. Good to have you out there, the Miss. Thanks for listening. I've got Brandon from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Brandon, how's it going, buddy? Good to have you out there. Last but certainly not least is Vermuri Salbatis from, bear with me, Bucharesti, Romania. Hey, good to have you, Vermuri. He's a blogger, all the way on a different side of the globe there. So that's cool. I appreciate everybody out there. And again, like I said before, it's good to have people liking the page or writing in saying hey or sending emails. Don't forget you can donate to this show if you would like. I'm not asking you to. Okay, maybe I am a little bit. But you can go to the Anchor Podcast app and you can scroll down and donate or whatever you want to do. So I'm thinking about later, and maybe if some people could let me know, I'm thinking about getting some t-shirts made up if anyone would be interested in anything like that. I have no idea. So I thought it might be cool just, for people to be able to show support for the show. So I think I may do that later on. Anyway, that stuff's not as important. I want to get to this episode, a part 2, and kind of pick up where we left off a couple of weeks ago. If you're listening in succession from episode 1 to 2, then it's much quicker than a couple of weeks. So if that's the case, I'm glad you didn't have to wait. So anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Again, I'm getting into the correspondence I've had with Dennis Rader, the notorious BTK serial killer who's in prison in Kansas. It's been an interesting and kind of I got to be honest, kind of a weird correspondence I've had, with anybody. The most weird in my life, I will definitely say to this point. So anyway, we're going to get right into this, and we're going to pick up where we left off. Again, thanks for listening. Good to have you out there.
You were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see. So you went to this residence, and what occurred then?
Well, I had did some thinking on what I was going to do to either Mrs. Otero or Josephine, and basically broke into the house, or didn't break into the house, but when they came out of the house, I came in and confronted the family, and then we went from there.
All right. After you tied them up, what occurred?
Well, they started complaining about being tied up, and I re-loosened the bonds a couple of times. Tried to make Mr. Otero as comfortable as I could. Apparently had a cracked rib from a car accident, so I had him put a pillow down for his head. Had he put I think he Parker or a coat underneath him.
So thoughtful. Very nice. Very nice of this guy.
They talked to me about giving the car and whatever money. I guess they didn't have very much money. And there I realized that I didn't have a mask on or anything. They already could ID me, and
too late.
Made a decision to go ahead and put them down, I guess, restraint.
So I'm just breaking in here. This is the court confession of Dennis Rader on the 10 victims that he was charged with the murders of. And I'm kind of skipping around in this because you can find it on YouTube, just called BTK Confession, full version. So this is almost 50 minutes of his explanation of what he did. Very matter of fact, very very flat, just explanation about almost like nonchalant. Well, I did this and this happened and they reacted this way, and showed no emotion. There were a couple times when he smiled during the confessions, but he I think he really ate up the coverage that he was getting in the cameras in the courtroom, as well as telling the judge about these grandiose events that he participated in. But anyway, we'll get right back into it here. I was just wanted to break in and let you know what I was doing.
After that, I did Mrs. Otero. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take. But
Was she also tied up there in the
yes,
bedroom?
yeah, both her hands and their feet were tied up. She was on the bed.
Where were the children?
Josephine was on the bed, and Junior was on the floor this time.
So this is in regards to count 2. You had, first of all, put the bag over Joseph Otero's head, and he tore a hole in the bag. Then you went ahead. Did you strangle Mrs. Otero then,
Okay.
or did you go
First
back?
of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, or a bag put over his head and strangled. Then I thought he was going down, and I went over and strangled Mrs. Otero. I thought she was down. Then I strangled Josephine. Thought she was down. And then I went over to Junior and put the bag on his head. After that, Mrs. Otero woke back up, and she was pretty upset in what's going on. So I came back, and at that point in time, strangled her for the death strangle at that time.
With your hands or what?
No, with a cord, with a rope. And then I think at that point in time, I redid Mr. Otero, put the bag over his head, went over, and then took Junior. Before that, she asked me to save her son. So I actually had taken the bag off, and then I was really upset at that point in time. So basically, when Mr. Otero was down, Mrs. Otero was down, I went ahead and took Junior, I put another bag over his head and took him to the other bedroom at that time.
What did you do then?
Put a bag over his head, I put a cloth over his head, a T-shirt, and a bag so he couldn't tear a hole in it. And he subsequently died from that. And then when I went back, Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
All right, you hung her in the basement?
Yes, sir.
All right, did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies. But that was after she was hung.
All right. What did you do then?
Went through the house, kind of cleaned it up. It's called the right-hand rule. You go from room to room. Picked everything up. I think I took Mr. Otero's watch. I guess I took a radio. I forgot about that, but apparently I took a radio.
Why did you take these things?
I don't know. I have no idea. Just
What happened then?
I got the keys to the car. In fact, I had the keys, I think, earlier before that because I wanted to make sure I had a way of getting out of the house. And clean the house up a little bit, make sure everything's packed up, and left through the front door. And went over to their car, and then drove over to Dylan's, left the car there, then eventually walked back to my car.
All right. Now, sir, from what you have just said.
So that was basically a full confession from the first 4 murders and the first murderous event that Dennis Rader was involved in. Like I said, very, very open. Seemed to really kind of eat up the coverage that was going on in the courtroom. Part of the BTK persona was that there were several elements that that he thrived off of. One was obviously the murders, because he kept repeating that. It wasn't so much, and what I found kind of different was that there were never any rapes involved. Although he did mention that he had fantasized about those, but it was more about the event of strangulation and bondage, and ultimately the desperation whenever someone knew that they were going to die. That was really what got him going. And there were times, and I did read one of the books that he told me about in our correspondence, that goes in really into pretty explicit detail on events that he felt like were pushing all this stuff. This Factor X is what he called it. And that was the one from Catherine Ramsland, the book called Confession of a Serial Killer. And I had mentioned that in the last episode. You can check that out if you want. But there were the bondage, the strangulation, the death, the trolling and stalking. I think what drove all of this was his very vivid fantasy life that he had since childhood. Because I asked him about it, the fantasy life, he said it was more like an addiction that grew from the fantasies to the real thing. And he said that there was violence in his early fantasies, and some of that eventually turned into animal cruelty. That's kind of where we left off in the last episode. But this fantasy life is something that I think is worth hovering over for a little bit. We all have a fantasy life, and when we're young, that's something that's looked at as, having imaginary friends and child's play, and a very vivid kind of almost reality that we make up for ourselves when we're playing games. And really what it comes down to is it's how we learn to navigate life, is from our early years. And Piaget had gotten into this, and I'm not going to go back in there and cover like developmental psychology, but you could look into his stuff if you wanted to. But a lot of our building blocks of how we evolve into what we are today come from play and fantasy and emulation and striving for things that we don't know anything about yet, like playing doctor or playing house or just whatever it is. Like we have an idea of what it is, and then we turn it into our own thing, But for him, he said that there was violence in his early fantasy life, and that was something that never really subsided. I think with a lot of people, violence is, we're exposed to it from an early age, especially nowadays. Our culture is really a violent culture, even though we're probably one of the safest places on the planet. Well, I say probably, we are one of the safest places on the planet. But generally, that's not something that that stays with us. It's like just a part of life. It's not everything. Now, I say that in this case because he wasn't someone who experienced like childhood traumas over and over, or wasn't physically or sexually abused growing up, so you could imagine somebody that had that kind of a background, that would stick with any of us more than likely. But his not so much. And the only thing that he said that really kind of made him tick as far as this, the violent fantasies that turned into animal cruelty, was that he remembers some times when his mother would spank him with a belt and hold his hands behind him. Now you could see that was, maybe kind of an early spawn of the bondage ritual, or the bondage, enticement that he had, that he carried out in his fantasy life. But not just that, he he called his penis Sparky. So he said that his mother had discovered some seminal stains and beat him for it, whenever he was 10 or 11. And she held his hands behind his back and used a man's belt to whip him. And he said, funny, it hurt, but Sparky liked it, so he got aroused when his mother was, beating him with this belt for finding, this, a natural sexual element that any of us have as, evidence of our beginning, sexuality. Well, she didn't like it, obviously. And when she noticed that he was getting aroused from it, she quit and said, like, oh my God, what have I done? So this was something early on for him that he noticed was a very salient point in beginning all of this. Now, he could just be saying this. I think with somebody who likes as much attention as he does, or at least likes the focus of his attention, he never says that this is an excuse or anything. He's just logically trying to put two and two together here, I think, and let people know what happened, as a child. Like, and he said he had a Christian upbringing and stuff like that. And I think if he was really trying to impress people by, things that he went through, he would, there's no telling what he would make up. So I just feel like at this point he's being honest, because he doesn't harp on it. He says what it is and he moves on. He doesn't stick around and add to it. And but I do think it's a pretty salient point in his background. So I asked him, do you think that BDSM or anything like that would ever have been helpful for you? And for those of you that don't know what that is, it's bondage, discipline, and sadomasochism. So it's something that like a dominatrix would do with you in a consensual relationship. And there's even professionals that you can go to in different parts of the country that use this as kind of a therapeutic sense for people who have these type of sexual proclivities. Not so much murder or strangulation, but there, are elements of bondage and control or lack of control that people need in these sexual elements. And he said that, he thought that it could have been helpful for him at one point. He said that he never crossed into any BDSM work. He said in his own sexual fantasies with bondage, he never reached out for anything like that. He was married, and he did say that he, compartmentalized or cubed the family man and the husband separate from the BTK stuff. So I can see where, if his wife knew that this stuff was going on, as far as like the violence, maybe she would have been for giving him an outlet, but she didn't. She did catch him a couple of times dressed up in women's lingerie. Like she came home from work one time and caught him, and she was really upset by it and took her a little bit of time, and they even talked about divorce, but they never did. But anyway, back on track here. So he said that he thought that BDSM would have been helpful for him if he had some kind of a release of the real thing, but I'm struggling to understand if the real thing meant actually killing somebody, because I think it did, because that seemed like in the stories, that's really what turned him on, was seeing that helplessness. And I think it would be, if it was staged with the dominatrix, maybe it wouldn't have been enough for him. I don't know. It definitely would have been. It sounds like he considered, I think it could have been helpful, so maybe it would have been something that he could have looked into. But he also got into Factor X, and I'll cover that next because I asked him about did he even understand what that was. It was something that he called this urge inside that he found difficult to control. So I think even though the BDSM, if it would have been helpful, there would have still been this other thing that was driving the desire to kill, or to actively, murder someone for sexual gratification. And that's what's considered a paraphilia in this case. And a paraphilia is something like deviant sexual acts like pedophilia or fetishism, or things that are out of the ordinary for the rest of us. It's actually a diagnosable mental illness. And in this case, with the death involved, it's called I can't even pronounce this thing. Erotophonophilia. So you can look that up. My English isn't good enough, I guess. But it's basically like a lust to murder. So it's a pretty big gap between BDSM and that. But anyway, so this Factor X that leads into this specific lust murder type of paraphilia. He said he knew, speaking of Factor X, he knew that something possessed him. And he said that from about age 11 in 5th or 6th grade, he noticed that something possessed him, is what he told me. And he said that that was the roots of Factor X. So he could look back to that point and pick out specifically. And it was also about the same age that his mother found herself saying, God, what have I done? To where he was turned on by getting beat by a belt and his hands held behind his back from her. He said that it started entering his life at that time. And he said that he still didn't know what it was. He said now, and he kind of left me hanging on this one a little bit. He said that he plans on maybe writing it out in 2019, 2020. And I'm guessing maybe like in a book or something, or maybe some kind of writings. But he said that it's he could identify where it started at around that time. But I thought that was interesting. That was one question that I had from the beginning, was like, what could have helped you not do this stuff, So, but that was what, I guess kind of what he came up with. Like, even though the BDSM could have helped, there was still this Factor X floating around that, if you feel like you've been possessed, it's going to be a tough one to call and say, well, maybe this would have worked and would have gotten rid of it. It's not like a typical, like, I'm stressed out, maybe this coping skill could help. No, this is totally something completely different. So he talked to me about, a further reflection of Factor X. And he said that he came up with a metaphor, because again, like, this guy had such a, I don't want to say a rich fantasy life, but I think he just gets lost in it, more than it's just typical daydream stuff. I really think he gets lost in it. But he said he came up with a metaphor for Factor X that was directly linked to the fish pond and his grandparents' place, where he started really, I'm wanting to say, losing himself in these fantasies. But he came up with a metaphor of a frog that he called Batter. And so he identifies this frog, and I've seen some pictures online that he has drawn of this thing. I think he fancies himself as kind of an artist. He's definitely creative, I'll give him that. But anyway, you can look online and check that out. And so this is another, kind of unconscious, like archetypal force I think that this guy had going on in his life and doesn't know, or at least didn't until I told him what I thought about it. I identified it as, back in ancient Egypt, there was a frog goddess of fertility, and her name was Heket, Hequet. So looking back in the psychoanalytic literature, back in Carl Jung's identification of some of the archetypal framework in his alchemical studies. So this, I'm not going to get into that. I'll spare you. But basically, so this is another archetypal pattern, just like the shadow is. And it's down deep in there. And so this is something that this guy made up, or at least he felt he made up on his own, but really there's some parallels with, fertility goddess. So this guy's going after women to strangle and kill them. Now he did kill males as well, but so I think that he was hitting on something that's maybe inside all of us that he pulled out and really took to a different level. But I thought it was interesting that he picked a frog for some reason, and this is all based on sexual fetishism and everything. And here you have an ancient Egyptian goddess that was based on fertility. So I thought that was an interesting parallel in this case. And like I said before in the last episode, that there's a lot of like unconscious kind of shadow imagery with this whole thing. But that was one thing that I found pretty interesting, especially with this depth of, this frog character in this fantasy world, that he said that the females could be dominated by the male, and this frog became his main creature in his thoughts. And again, he linked it back to his like grandparents' fish pond and stuff. So I feel like there's some things in there that are missing that kind of connect this stuff with the archetypal framework, but this is where my knowledge stops. It's where I run out. But I just feel like there's more to it. Now again, we're talking, I'm sending letters back and forth with this guy, so it's not like I was able to sit in the same room with him, because I really could have asked a lot of questions that I thought would be probably helpful. Although I did think that was pretty insightful, that he could come up with that and be able to identify, these unconscious kind of markers that are driving this stuff without even knowing that's what it was. So the next question I asked him was, how did you, or did you find yourself kind of aloof during these periods with your family, this time with your family? So you've got all this stuff going on. We're talking about and he goes deep with not just the fantasy life, but he went as far as to keep files. He would take clippings of magazines out. He called them slick ads. He had names for everything that he was doing. But so he would take pictures of certain types of situations out of magazines. He said Red Book was a big one. Like, this guy was a, avid reader of the ladies' mags, but also like fantasy, detective magazines that you could get at the stores back in the 70s, 80s. And he would clip pictures out and attach them or glue them to these 3x5 index cards, and he'd file them away. And he had different files for women with different hair color and ages and races, and he would thumb through these, and he called some of these things that he did, and he had more things than just this, but this is just an example. He'd call them hotel parties. So sometimes he would travel for work, and he would take this paraphernalia with him, and ladies' undergarments, and things like that he could wear at these parties by himself. These were self parties. So he would put this stuff on and look at these pictures and masturbate and wear wigs, and in the meantime he's doing all this stuff alone. And he would take some of these index cards and with a picture of a redhead that he liked, for instance, and put it in his pocket, and he would drive around with it in his pocket all day for work and stuff, and he would fantasize to himself that he was out with a hot redhead all day, and so he would take all this stuff that he had going on, and he had a lot. He had hidden not passages, but like panels underneath drawers and stuff where he would hide these things from his family. He called them hidey holes, like this guy had names for stuff. And he would hide all this like paraphernalia of his, of all of his magazines and his ropes and his, he called it his hit kit, the thing that he would take to these murders, and he'd have like a little, like bag full of stuff he would use. So he would also take trinkets, and he would take memorabilia from the house that he murdered people on, or in. And so he would hide all this stuff at home. He would hide it at church. He would hide it at his job. But he made sure he was very thorough. And I think that's what sets this guy apart from so many other serial killers and killers. Like Ted Bundy, for instance, he was there toward the end of his crimes, was much more impulsive and spur of the moment, without thought, without planning, would do these murders. And he did say he got way better at it the more he did it. But he wasn't a planner like BTK. BTK had another, persona going on because he was a family man and a dad and, had a job. He wasn't just out killing folks and supporting his habit by, whatever means because he was a single guy. What he had to do was be very compartmentalized. And I asked him about that, because he had so much going on. I'm like, were you aloof at this time? Because it just seems like there was so much happening that, just like when we get stressed at work and we come home and we're not ourselves. Like, could you imagine being out killing people, planning this stuff? He said that he would troll neighborhoods and stalk people for sometimes years at a time. So obsessed by this stuff, but yet he was still able to compartmentalize all of that without his family being suspicious. So who knows us better than our loved ones? And when something's bothering us, our loved ones are there to say, like, what's going on with you? Like, how come whatever? No, not with this guy. Like, he was so divided between normal life and all this other stuff that it didn't show, and I find that fascinating. And you hear about people that have dissociative identity disorder, but I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a continuum that most of us are on at some point with that, that certain diagnosis, but it just seems like he was able to compartmentalize so easily. And he did tell me that it got way better throughout the duration of his crimes because he was able to plan and be very thorough and then not have to have that anxiety of people finding out. There were times right after the murders where he was scared that he'd get caught and he would destroy evidence and stuff like that. But after a month or two, he said that like that would wear off, and then he would go back to his old MO. So, but he said that he learned how to cube very quickly and have all the human emotions that a normal person would have, and still be able to do all this stuff away from home. He did have times where he was out of work, and those seemed to be the times that he did so much more of, he had free time, so he could stalk and he could troll neighborhoods, on a whim if he wanted to. But I really think that this makes this case that much more interesting, is that he could, even though he was in times where he was notably stressed by unemployment or whatever, he could go out and do this stuff and nobody would be the wiser. And he still seems like he cared for his family at the time, although I did hear his daughter Carrie on an interview say that she was very taken aback and very upset when she heard her dad say that the family was basically just a front, and that's what he thought of them. And she hasn't seen him since he's been in prison, as far as I know. She did say she's written a couple of times, but you could imagine, all of the work that she would have had to go through after finding this out about her dad, back in 2004, whenever he got caught, finally. So I asked him, all this other stuff aside, I asked him, like, what were some things that he struggles with today? Obviously he's in prison, so probably not having the best time. He's in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, but he said that he's trying to bring his life to a close. He said he lived a good life, but took the wrong path. He said he's trying to unscramble that path, although history he has with it. He feels like he has a right to know, and others should as well. So I think that there's some stuff in there that he's still not sure about, like how all of this happened. I think he likes to think that he has the most control over even like knowing the information on why, because obviously he's been subject to a lot of people, including the psychologists that have talked to him or went and visited him and wrote books on him. So he understandably knows some things about himself, probably that he didn't before. But he says that he still has things that he'd like to know. He said he's got health concerns. And he said that, his dad died when he was 74 back in 96, and his mom died when she was 82 in 2007. And he said, will I live to be in between those two ages? Will I live to 78? He said he hopes to make it to 75, and that would be in the year 2020. And he said, then I'll see. He said he plans on semi-retiring in 2020 from the world. So I'm trying to read into some of this, but it's hard to, without actually having a conversation with the guy. So I don't know if he means retiring from the world literally, like he's going to kill himself or, whatever. But anyway, it sounds like that's something that he struggles with. So not being sure about things like his own death. And I think that's a lot of us, we have that kind of existential, like nobody knows kind of thing going on. And for somebody like him who has thrived off of control his entire life, that's understandable that bugs him, that he doesn't have control over it. But wouldn't it be interesting that he took control? He said that he had thoughts of suicide in the past, but it never panned out. He was always able to move past that and continue with life. He said that he thought about hanging himself before, that would be exciting sexually to him. But I would say that they probably keep a pretty close watch on him with his egregious crimes and his bondage fantasies. The prison would have to know about all of that. So I would imagine that there's probably, I guess you can get anything in prison, but it would make sense to me if he did hang himself or something, because that's the ultimate control, right? Because we all are able to choose if we want to live or die, and that would probably be the coup de grace, or whatever you want to call it. That would be his final act, or the swan song that would take him out finally, that he had ultimate control over when he died, because his crimes didn't get him the death penalty, because it wasn't a thing in Kansas until a few years after the last murder. So it is now, but at the time they couldn't try him and it go to like a death penalty like case, because of, at the time, it didn't exist in that state. So I also asked him, like, what's he do? Like, you got an hour, outside to exercise and shower a couple of times a week, I think is what it was. He said that he writes poetry, he works on art. Obviously, he writes to people. He's a pagan, so that's one thing I found interesting when I got the letters, was that he would make drawings and indications about, like, what the month of March was Mars in the pagan calendar, or pagan religious system, whatever it is. I didn't even get into paganism, because who knows, but the last letter he wrote was on Pi Day, and he wrote that down in there, that he wanted to make sure that I knew it was 3.14 was pi, and that was the day he was writing. But he calls himself the Kansas Pisces in the kind of like signature on his letterhead. He's got a little drawing of a fish and some other symbology in there. And he does denote some interest in paganism. He did say he's currently reading a book called Pagan Ways, and that's on Amazon if you're interested. So he does that stuff, the pagan thing. He said he likes to play chess by mail, and poker or card games. Of Guillotine is a card game, which you can also find that on the internet. And then Sudoku is one of his favorite, like puzzles, because he likes math problems, apparently. But that was something that I didn't know was a thing. So you can play chess over the mail with somebody. It seems like it would take a long time, but he does that. And then the last question I had for him, and there were a few in here I didn't cover because this, would probably take up too much time. But the last question I asked him was about his daughter and his family. And I asked if you could say anything to your daughter about the man you are today, what would it be? And how would you like people to remember you? And I was hoping to get some kind of I don't know, maybe something human out of this whole thing after all. And he said, first of all, speaking to his daughter, I love you and family very much. That's Dad speaking, not BTK. But I live with each. I hope she and my family remember, as a good family man, in my love to them, that there was a dark nightmare, and that was our final years together. I believe I'm like, just as a side note, the grammar's not the best, so even though the police caught him, the grammar police are probably still after him. I'll be honest with you. It was tough reading through this stuff. I believe that what I would hope others to remember for me, that was once a good man that had a real nightmare of reality and never woke up! ! So then he went on after this, and he thanked me for not asking too many dark questions. And went on to say he's a very busy man and that time is priceless, even more as I agree, I age, and I downsize. Maybe he does stay busy writing letters. I'm sure there's a lot of people, excluding myself, that find the time to write in and talk to him. So, anyhow, it sounds like he's trying to wind things down in the next couple of years. And I don't know, whenever I asked some questions, I did tell him, like, I'm not trying to provoke any more anxiety that you've already gotten or already have, that I had some questions, and I wasn't gonna dig too deep if he because I didn't know if he was gonna write me back or not, and it's hard to get a read on somebody I've never met before. Although when I began to write, I knew that he likes attention. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you're sending letters to a TV station and police and the newspaper about things that you've did that you don't want to get caught at, but still want to find the time to get recognition, and to be able to control the story and control the narrative that's being told about you. So I knew, that he had quite a bit of grandiosity, and I thought that he would probably write back, but at the same time, like, if he was doing better, I didn't want to bombard him with, so much stuff that he was just going to be like, wad it up and throw it away and say, forget this guy. So I did want to, like, at least have a conversation, because I wasn't doing it to judge him at all. I found the case interesting, and I still find this guy's, judgment aside, like, the things that he did and went through, interesting in a way that, isn't like morbid, but just out of curiosity, like, because you don't get a chance to talk to people like this. But anyway, so he thanked me for not asking too many dark questions. So I thought that was interesting that he would say that. He did say that he's not the happiest with his treatment there with the guards, and he said that they've been on kind of a witch hunt for the last year or so. Not sure why, he didn't go into it, but he did make some notations. So the letter that I sent to him, and again, like, he's very meticulous, and he's very mindful of what he writes and how he writes it. So all of the pages in the letters were listed and numbered and lettered and very thorough and very very deeply, like, looked into. So there were a couple of things that he underlined and wrote, like, radar beside, and I didn't know what this guy was doing whenever he was doing this. But later on in the letter, I noticed that he said that he's trying to fly under the radar because he don't like attention from the guards. Because apparently they're not the happiest whenever he gets attention from like national news and stuff. This is what I'm gathering. Like, he didn't say these things, but there were some kind of coded kind of writing that he would write back and say about certain things. So I think some of it he tries to, in his own way, say what he wants without coming right out in the open, to where, because letters that come and go from prisons are monitored and read, and they want to make sure that there's not going to be material that people don't get, or that people aren't supposed to get, or that's not going to spur some type of response from them that's going to be a negative impact to probably staff or other, inmates. So, and that's completely understandable. Honestly, I'm surprised that people can even, correspond, but I don't know much about the prison system, but anyway, and a couple times he had underlined and written like radar by a certain wording that I would use whenever I was writing him. So I understand that he probably doesn't want me to use those words anymore if I ever write back into him, because he says that he doesn't want that kind of attention. He said he suggests that I fly under the facility radar too. He said plain Jane is better to get because you don't get attention from the guards, or maybe things don't get lost as they come in, and he never gets a hold of. So anyway, he told me, let's see what else. There was so much content in here, and even though he was pretty meticulous, like there were some things that I noticed were kind of like coded, and I don't know if part of that's just the way his language is kind of on and off. Like I said, the grammar police wouldn't be happy with him. He's probably gotten a few tickets on this letter right here already. He did want me to know that this was March's full moon when he wrote this back, that this is the pagan's chaste moon, and the release of Persephone from the lake of death. So there we go with some more mythology and more shadow imagery. Persephone was this mythic figure, and I recognized that when I saw it. She did something to irritate Hera, I think it was Zeus's wife, and got sent to Hades and became Hades' wife and could come out certain times of the year. That's what it was. So the moon is somehow attached to Persephone, and she spends half of her time in Hades and the other half of the time out in the open. And so, which she is also a fertility goddess, if I remember right, because you've got the moon cycles, and knowing when to plant, and plants only grow in the daytime when she's out, and when she's in Hades, it's dark outside for, the 12 hours of the 24 or whatever it is. So again, like more shadow imagery. So you can look into that if you would like. The more I dig into things like what I've covered in these podcasts, the more parallels I'm starting to see with, and I think Freud got to this point too, because, oh God, there he goes. He's talking about Freud again. No, but like Freud based a lot of his theories off of mythology, because that was, and you can listen to previous podcasts. I'm not going to get into it, but because I'm digressing here, but I'm sorry, but Freud identified a lot of the psychological framework and linked them to the stories of the old Greek and Roman myths, and even Egyptian myths, which, because the Greeks and the Romans borrowed all of their stuff from the Egyptians, it was older. But Freud linked that stuff to the stories because people didn't know, there were no psychologists back then. So he linked those to the stories of these archetypal framework that we have. And, the gods of old are today's like disorders. So that's maybe something you can look into too. But the more I get into these podcasts and these episodes about various psychological issues, the more I find, the more I understand that Freud knew what he was talking about, because a lot of times it leads back into myth and archetype, and you're probably sick of me saying that word by now, but anyway, I find it interesting that things end up coming back to those old stories and the old, and even ancient reflections of who we were at one time. But anyway, he says, and this is where I found it interesting, that he even says, I sometimes live half my life in the light and the other half in the dark underworld. I was born in March. It was preordained, so I guess this is like fatalism or something. With my military comparison, so this is his take on things, that Mars was the war god of Rome. And he says something about victims, but I couldn't read what he wrote. But anyway, Mars is also March, so and that goes, I guess, back to paganism. But anyway, that's what I had for him. I could have spent a lot more time on this, I think, but this is not a true crime podcast, so I think I would probably have gotten tired of it. But I think I was able to pull some parallels out that hopefully people are able to walk away with and have learned something from. I know I did, for sure. Not just by, a lot of the stuff he said, but some of the key points were really telling for me, to be able to look in a criminal's mind and know a little bit about them, and know enough about, the psychoanalytic literature and even the mythological stuff that goes on for a lot of us. So I hope you found this useful, and I hope you enjoyed this 2-part series. I know I did. I had a pretty good time doing it. I got this second one out quicker than I thought I was going to, but it really just seemed like it took forever, because in the meantime I was trying to learn as much as I could and go through this book that Catherine Ramsland wrote and everything else, that's going on in my life right now. So I'm glad that people are starting to download more and listen more to the podcast, and I appreciate that a lot. I want everybody to know that I care that you're out there, and I'm doing this, because I think that I would have been interested in something like this without my training. So I'd like your feedback. You can email me at mindoutpodcast@gmail.com. Tell me what you're thinking. I've been in contact with some people that I'm gonna have on the show probably later this spring, and it should get interesting having another live person with me here. So I'm looking forward to that a lot. Okay. Well, I hope you have a good week. I don't mean to repeat myself, but I am glad people are out there listening. And again, hit me up. Let me know what you're thinking. And I will see you next time. Stay tuned. I'll probably mention on Twitter or Facebook what I'm going to talk about next, because I normally do.